Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Your host, Caroline Offenstein here. And today we have one of my virtual friends who I talk to all the time online, Kat. It is so good to see you today. Thank you for being here.
Hey, Caroline, it is so great to be here. Really excited to chat with you today. And I'm also so glad that we connected online and have this
I
little
know.
second degree connection we discovered.
Yeah, I know.
Yay.
Believe it or not, my cousin lives in Florida and grew up in Florida. And you guys went to high school together, right?
Yes, and not only that, but she was actually assigned as my mentor. I was her mentee when I was 11 and just started middle school. She was a few years older, and now 2 decades later, look how we're all
Oh
connected.
my gosh. That is
Right.
whenever whenever I get like, oh, I don't like social media, like it's ruining our lives or whatever, then I think about, connections like these and like being able to meet you virtually and listen to your podcast and just like grow my community of like crunchy moms. Then I'm like, oh, okay, social media can actually be used for good if you choose to.
Yes, it is so true. It's all about that balance because I mean,
Mhm.
99% of the like-minded mom friends I have are thanks to Instagram. So there's always a light at the end of the tunnel of this darkness in the social world.
Yes, yes. And so I have so much I'd love to pick your brain about today. But before we get into that, can you just say a little bit about who you are, what you do, that sort of thing?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm a mom, I'm a wife. I have an almost 2-year-old son. He'll be 2 next month. I'm expecting my second, not sure if it's a boy or girl. I'm having a wild pregnancy. I guess you could say, give or take, I'm early third trimester. And so I used to be I guess, a corporate, I'm not even going to say the term boss babe. It is
Do
so
it. Say
cringy. It
it.
is so grotesque, but I used to think that like the pinnacle, of everything of just success in life was, making it to the top career wise. And a lot of that was a part of my identity. And I went to, I grew up in Southwest Florida, moved to New York City, moved back to New York City where I was born. And I spent a decade there. And I'm living quite a different life. I think it's taken a 180 for the best. But yeah, I made I guess, the radical decision, whatever you want to call it, to leave the corporate workforce 2 months before I began what I thought was going to be only a 12-week maternity leave. So, like you, I decided to leave work and focus on being a mom full time. And then when my son was about 6 months old, my friend April and I, we were already connected, but we decided to start the podcast Moms Off the Record. So we've been doing that for a little over a year and a half. And on the podcast, we release new episodes every other week. We discuss all practices and philosophies that impact moms and their babies, all the way from pregnancy into motherhood. Typically, it's the quote controversial topics that moms are too scared to discuss with their pediatrician or the other moms at the playground. We don't hesitate to touch on those topics. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about me in a long-winded response.
Yeah. And Moms Off the Record is, I think, how I found you. Now I don't know if Michelle sent me like your podcast or if I just found it. But either way, like I love it. I'm totally obsessed with your guys' podcast. I get so excited about what you and April are talking about. And it feels like a breath of fresh air
Thank
because
you.
you guys are you speak so like strongly and without hesitancy about these controversial things. I mean, I was just texting with a mom who I actually met through Free Birth Society. So
Oh,
I know we have some similar views. And she even told me, like, I don't really talk about vaccinations or like, I don't really talk about any of those, like you said, controversial things with my friends because I'm too afraid to lose friends, like her
yeah.
local friends. And I just thought, wow, one, that's like harsh judgment to expect from other people.
Yeah.
And two, I immediately could see where I was doing that in my own life and how I still probably self-censor myself in a lot of
Yes.
ways to not offend people, to be the good girl, to be the people pleaser, right? I would
Yes.
love to hear your thoughts on that, like how I see you guys as not self-censoring and
Thank you.
you just say it how it is, how you feel it is at least. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I would love to. So, first off, I spent years self-censoring, and I'm not going to lie, I do think that when I was in the corporate workforce and I worked for a large employer, I don't think I would have had the courage to be as bold as I am today. And I know a lot of people fall into this boat because usually it does mean that you will be ostracized. You're not going to be invited in any, group opportunities, and that's really scary. So I will say that the moment I did leave the corporate workforce and I felt like a free agent was the moment I could truly speak my mind. I started to plant seeds with certain friends who I either wasn't sure where they stood on certain topics, or I had a feeling, I just had an instinct that maybe we're more aligned than I think we are. And I would drop little seeds here just to see what's their reaction. I would test the waters, right? So for example, instead of going all out and saying like I'm anti-vax, I would start off by saying like, oh, you know what? I know Florida gets so much hate, but I really love how it's the medical freedom state. What do you think? Because and then I can gauge, do I want to go deeper with this friend? Is it worth it to me? So I think this is an important question to ask yourself when you're afraid of losing potential friends, is ask yourself, would I be okay with never ever talking to this person again if it meant standing up for what I believe in? So that's one way to do it. And it is scary losing lifelong friends. I can't tell you, Caroline, how many friends, sadly, I've already lost as a result of just sharing information, not even my opinion, information on the podcast. And it doesn't, the friendships don't dissolve with a bang, by the way. It's really just ghosting, which maybe that's a better thing, right? Not everything has to be some big breakup in your face, like so traumatic, but it is sad. It's a loss. But then I have to remind myself, like, can I really consider this lifelong friend or this new friend a true friend if they're willing to just ghost me because we have a difference in opinion? And I will say, my theory is that ever since the advent of going all the way back to Facebook, which most people in our generation aren't even on Facebook anymore. We think of that as a boomer thing. But I think since the advent of Facebook, I want to say around 2007, 2008, when it was more mainstream, and you saw people posting very divisive opinions on their walls. That to me was just the start of people unfriending people and canceling others for their beliefs. Because I even remember going back to the mid 90s when I was a young kid in grade school, when we would have these like fake elections in first grade, and it was like, who are you going to vote for and why? That would never happen in like the school system today, because like you can only vote for one person or you are Hitler, essentially, right? So it used to be the case where you could even get married to someone. Now, I personally wouldn't do this, but I respect people who do. You could be married to someone who has very different political opinions than you do. That was normal. Now we're at a point where if you so much as whisper a different opinion from your friend, you can expect for the most part to be canceled. I have two friends. One of them I've known since I was like 8. One of them I've known since I was 15. One's a guy, one's a girl, a woman. Sorry, not a girl, a woman. Um,
I love that.
and
Thank you for correcting yourself because I
yes,
really dislike when
yeah.
people call me like a girl. Like, no.
Right. And that is something I've had to consciously work on for a while. Yeah, we are women, not little
Mhm.
girls.
Mhm.
When we were 8, we were girls. But so I have these two friends, and they are more liberal leaning. They're not leftists by any means. And I used to consider myself like a diehard liberal. And because the pendulum has swung so far to one side with just craziness, I guess you could call, I don't like to label myself, but I know I'm not that. So they have listened to some of the episodes that we've put out on these controversial topics, and they told me after in text, they're like, I just want to say I really appreciate the fact that you've spoken about these topics. I don't necessarily agree with everything you said, but I found X, Y, and Z really intriguing, and I'm going to do more research on this. That I respect,
Oh, yes.
right?
Yes.
So here's the thing. It is when you decide to stand up for what you believe in, it is scary at first. You probably will lose friends. You have to be okay with that. So I think that leaving the corporate workforce helped ground me, but also because I hate to say this, but like because I'm not like single and I have this solid like rooted family, right? Like I know I always have my husband and my family. I have my son no matter what at the end of the day. If I didn't have any family and all I had were these friends, I probably would have to self-censor more to be likable so that I wasn't alone, because it's right human instinct. We don't want to be alone, but I know I always have my family. And when you start to speak up more for what you believe in, yes, you will shed the old friends who don't align with you, but you will attract new friends. And that's been the beautiful thing of this. So there's that. And also, I've had to come to terms with like, it is impossible to maintain and foster emotional intimacy with a friend if you are constantly self-censoring. I don't know about you, but I cannot sit here and just talk about the weather and traffic logistics. I will be
Good
bored
point.
to death.
Good point.
So that's what I think about that.
Yeah. It's like as a collective, we could all get better at being inquisitive, being curious, um, having those open-ended discussions. Like it's funny that we started this talking about the pros and cons of social media, but I hope most people are now aware that the algorithm shows you an echo chamber. I mean, like the stuff my husband gets on his feed, because he's a little bit more, he like loves going down this conspiracy theory rabbit holes all the way. And he's a little bit more right-leaning now. And the stuff that he tells me that he sees on his feed, I'm like, what in the hell?
Right.
You
And it
know,
can
it's
also be
just like,
extreme.
And so social media wants to feed you that extreme content, because then you're commenting and you're like, oh my God, and you're like freaking out and you're getting engaged and you're getting worked up. And it's so easy to be that keyboard warrior, right? Like I stopped
Oh, yeah.
commenting on anything that like really lights me up, because I'm like, this is what they want. Don't do it.
Completely. That's absolutely true. And also, speaking of keyboard warriors, 99% of the people who are so comfortable and like uncensored saying these completely ridiculous troll-like comments on strangers' posts, they would never dare say anything near that level in person. They wouldn't have the
Mhm.
courage to. So I try to always ask myself, like, would I have the courage to say this to someone in person? Like, is it productive? Is it helpful? And of course,
Mhm.
human nature. Sometimes like we say things like, you know what, that was too harsh. I regret it. But yeah, the trolling, the keyboard warriors are really something else.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's it's important to also like think about how we're saying things, right? I mean, obviously you and April preface your podcast episodes with like, hey, we're going to talk about this stuff, like we're going to be honest about how we feel. And so if someone is like continuing to listen, they're accepting that, it feels like, right?
Yeah.
And in person, I think it's so important to yeah, just like be more open to different opinions. I feel like COVID really put us in these boxes of like pro or con vaccine and all of these labels and name calling, and it just got ugly. I had two really close friends who we just like couldn't talk for a while. And
Yeah.
and it was kind of heartbreaking, but like one of them, their spouses even said some really mean stuff online. And I was like, wow, okay, like that's how you feel. Uh, that sucks. I guess we're not going to talk for a while, which is basically
Yeah.
what happened. And it's interesting too to see like all that's come out now. A lot of those people, I try not to hold a grudge, but like no one has apologized for the mean stuff they said at those times. If you weren't running to Walgreens to get the latest drop of vaccines, like,
Mhm.
which is kind of, well, also no one's been prosecuted, which I find to be like a huge problem at the
Oh,
national
yeah.
level. But yeah, it's just uh, we all need like a lot of heart opening to be able to move in
Yes.
this direction of getting out of the extremes. And I think, you know, it's like there's a contraction before every expansion, just like in birth.
Right.
And I feel like right now
Yes.
we are in this like contracted, everyone has to be this side or that side space. And I do feel like maybe things are going to get a little bit worse before they get better, but
Yeah. I'm kind of with you. I think too, people need to just turn off mainstream media. And I don't care what you're watching on TV. I get it. Look, sometimes I get hooked in because it is a form of entertainment. I'm not a fan of any mainstream news, but yeah, it can suck you in. I don't watch any of the left leaning ones, I will say, but it is funny to see whether you're watching right leaning or left leaning. They all talk about the same recycled topics. They have been for years. So I think it's important to just turn off mainstream news. Just don't watch the news. I know we were taught in history class as kids, like you have to watch the news so that you can be interesting, in circles and like show that you're up to date on current events. There's other things you can talk about.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And I know with it being an election year, like it is so crazy, but yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean, just remember you don't have to vote for just the right or the left. There are other options. I'm just gonna say that out there,
Very
especially if
true.
you listen to him speak. But
Yes. No
but
hints.
yeah, but yeah, I just I hope that we can all move to a place where we're like open to speak more about like what's on our hearts and from our hearts and not from like this I know best and but like also then being open to listen. I just heard someone the other day say like we have two ears and one mouth for a reason, and I'm like I like that.
That is so true. Yes, we've all become very self-righteous. And of course, right, when you are passionate about any subject and you feel you've researched it, and April and I have talked about this on our podcast, like the topics we choose to discuss every other week, we handpick them because we're so passionate and we do feel well researched at the same time. So that two things can be true. Yes, that's a good thing. It shows, you're dedicated. Like it's great to be well researched, but it's also so important to maintain some level of humility so that when you do stumble across better, different information, that you can think critically and say, like, this is why I'm changing my mind. And it doesn't mean that you're fickle or wishy-washy, but you can deliberately, very carefully, in a discerning way, change your mind. And I think it makes you more human and relatable. And so people who so tightly cling on to these ideologies for years, and they're so afraid of the labels they're going to receive if they shift away from them, that's where it becomes really problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I did want to kind of talk about vaccines on that note for a little bit, just because I
Yeah.
know you know so much, and I've just dabbled a little bit on the podcast, kind of talking about what I believe. And I've been trying to work on what you just said, as far as not coming off as like, hey, this is what I've discovered, so like everyone should do it this way, but more so, what honestly gets me the most fired up is everything I learn I have had to dig for and like go to
Yes.
all these different sources and like figure out like what's bullshit and what's probably more factual. And I hate that. Like, I don't like using the word hate, but I do hate that because that is not informed consent. And
Mm-hmm.
how are parents supposed to be making the right decision for their family? Which at the end of the day, that is what I want all parents to do. Like, you totally do
Yes.
not have to parent like me. I want you to parent with however strategies that work for you. But if you don't have all the information, how can you do that? I mean, of course you can lead from your intuition. But I think usually that aligns honestly with like the most true, clear, transparent information as well. Um, I would love it if you could just give maybe like a synopsis of your view on vaccines, because they are such like a huge controversial topic.
Yes, absolutely. And, I proudly say for any listeners out there who are not familiar with my stance, like I am anti-vax after doing my research. That term has been thrown around in order to be a pejorative. It's supposed to be an insult. To me, it's just a neutral term. I am anti-vaccine based on the extensive research I've done, the interviews, all of the vaccine injuries that I have personally witnessed and heard secondhand accounts from other moms and mom friends. So I'm with you, Caroline. Like, it is not about us telling other moms what to do with their bodies or their children's bodies, but it's about having the information and providing informed consent, which sadly you cannot expect true informed consent from 99% of pediatricians or OBs or really any doctor. Sadly, they're not even given this informed consent when they're in medical school. Most of them have been programmed and indoctrinated, unless you're seeing, of course, a naturopathic doctor, a unicorn doctor, and there are ways to find these. But so a high level synopsis on vaccines, and really this could be like a 5-hour discussion, but there's there's more risks than benefits. Let's start off with some of the most common childhood vaccines, right? So you have measles, mumps, and rubella. Um, you're not able to separate those. It's multivalent. So MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella. So everybody, especially recently, has been talking about measles outbreaks here and there. It's so scary. Just going back to the basics, measles used to be considered a completely common childhood illness that was naturally contracted, including when we were growing up in the 90s. My husband and lots of his friends naturally contracted measles in Sweden in the 90s. It was not a big deal. It would be the equivalent of us contracting chickenpox naturally, which I also contracted naturally. Not a big deal, nothing to be alarmed over. So this is just one of several examples of, let's call them the common childhood illnesses that used to be common, where your immune system actually becomes more intelligent after you contract these illnesses through natural means, not through vaccination. There's actually, for example, with measles, if you contract it naturally, and I don't have exact statistics, I'm bad at rattling those off the top of my head, but let's just say the vast majority of people who will contract measles will not only survive, but they're actually going to thrive after. So it's a nuisance, right? It's not a scary thing. It's annoying. Yeah, symptoms are annoying. So what? When you're sick, it's not fun. It's annoying, but you get over it. Your risk of getting cancer later in life, certain cancers, actually decreases. And there's tons of studies out there that have actually shown that through nutrition, it's one of the best ways to recover quickly from measles, and even to potentially prevent it is through real vitamin A absorption through real whole foods. So I'm not talking about beta carotene. I'm talking about like the type of vitamin A that you would find, in liver, for example. So this is where the leading with like a whole foods lifestyle that's very nutrient dense, and also having the education and information on like, wait, this isn't something I should really fear. Why am I jumping to the latest jab? This is where those things can really go hand in hand to empower moms. So I can't sit here and tell a mom like, hey, you should or shouldn't give this child this vaccine. But what I can say is like, most people are just fine contracting them. I would personally this is going to sound outrageous to most people. I recognize that. I was almost scared to say it out loud, but I'll just go for it. I would have zero fears about my son contracting measles naturally. I'm asked this all the time, like, oh, so you'd rather that he gets it naturally as opposed to giving the vaccine? 1000% hands down. Okay, so let's talk about the vaccines then. Why not the vaccine? You're not just talking about the actual virus, whether it's live or dead, being injected. There are a handful of excipients and adjuvants added to these vaccines, including mercury and aluminum, formaldehyde, aborted fetal cells, polysorbate 80 preservatives. So I guess you could make the argument, well, everything in moderation. If your child has a good detoxification system, right? Like no big deal. But here's the real problem. When we were growing up and I was on the quote childhood schedule growing up. Like, yes, we were very 80-20 for the 90s. I was born in 1990. I was not homeschooled though. I went to a private school. There were certain jabs, and my mom was an RN, a registered nurse, including a pediatric nurse for 13 years. She refused to give us the HPV vaccine. She's like, why are you getting a reproductive, vaccine like for potential STIs? Like, this doesn't make any sense. We were never allowed to get the flu shot. So she was open-minded for her time then. But in terms of the other, the polio, like I did get all
Mhm.
those.
Mhm.
Jumping ahead now, over 20 years later, these poor children, this vulnerable population, where they're growing their immune systems and their brains and their bodies are developing, if you follow the CDC schedule as it is today, your child will be getting 72 shots by the time he or she's 18 years old. This isn't normal. This isn't healthcare. This is sick care. Healthcare, to me, is letting your child play in the dirt and the mud to improve their gut microbiome, is not giving them jabs, is helping them heal through homeopathy, and also nutrient dense foods and sunshine and sleep, letting them run around. That's healthcare. Okay, so big picture, right? We talked about the mysterious and harmful heavy metals and ingredients in the vaccines, right? So risky. We know that contracting first of all, contracting the common illnesses naturally, there is a huge health benefit down the line. But let's talk about some of the rarer ones. Like, someone asked the other day, that we get a lot of DMs, someone asked us about like rubella and how, of course, there's a family member, doctor putting pressure on her. She has to get like the rubella shot. What about her baby? So it's very easy to look up, like, and I'm not saying that I like the FDA or the WHO or the CDC. I don't trust these corporations, but you have to ask yourself, like, if these captured three-letter agencies and corporations are even telling you that there were, let's call it 10 reported cases of rubella in the last year out of what do we have, like 330 million people in this country? To me, that risk doesn't justify, like, the likelihood of catching rubella naturally in our overly sanitized modern first world country doesn't justify a rubella jab, which would be in the MMR. There have been so many instances reported of adverse reactions and effects, and I don't know about you guys out there, but I would much rather trust a mom's firsthand account of what she witnessed her child go through, as opposed to what a pediatrician who sees your child for 10 minutes at a time um, is reporting, quote, seeing your child go through after a shot, right? We're talking about having major regressions, like all of a sudden a child who's totally verbal becoming nonverbal, just quote out of the blue, but like just a few days or a couple of weeks after getting these jabs. So the funny thing is, there's a correlation happening between the more frequently our children are being jabbed with these toxins and the more unhealthy our society is becoming. We've been fed the narrative that like vaccines, it's modern science, it's a medical miracle, right? Like, we're going to be so healthy because we're so vaccinated, we're protected against polio, measles. Well, guess what? Look around. We're not okay. We are metabolically and chronically ill. Our kids are obese. Our kids are nonverbal, regressing, all sorts of autoimmune issues. Why is it that in schools it's now normalized that children can't bring in anything with nuts, um, dairy, eggs, you name it? Like, this is not health. I could go on. I mean, are there any aspects that maybe I haven't mentioned that you want me to touch on? Because, like I said, I could go on for hours.
Well, I think a really important point here that I was just talking to my husband about the other day, because most of my family disagrees with our decisions, and we just don't talk about it anymore. But it's so interesting how I think people really don't want to accept it because it's scary to think that these organizations who are supposed to be supporting our health, who are supposed to be making it safer for us to live here and survive and thrive, could have such malicious intention. And I go back and forth on this because I do not think that the creators of vaccines are trying to hurt children. I definitely don't believe that. I believe that we have a capitalistic society to our core, and you have to follow the money.
Yes.
And people are so, like, everyone, I think, like readily accepts what Purdue Pharmaceuticals did with Oxy, right? And how they knew it was addictive. Like they've paid billions and billions of dollars in lawsuits that they have lost because we have proven they actually did know it was addictive, but they were making so much money and they were buying doctors and hello, profits. Like they
Oh
kept
yeah.
increasing their profits. And now there are, right, there was Dope Sick. There was that other show with Ferris Bueller, whatever his real name
Oh,
is.
oh yeah, yes. I just saw that one actually. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
with the Oxy, yeah, and
Yep.
he looks a lot
Yeah.
older than
And he
his real
was
life.
the
Yes.
part of the Sackler family. Yeah.
Yes.
And so like I feel like it is widely accepted that a drug company did the dirty.
Oh
They
yeah.
knew all of these terrible things were going to happen, but they were bankrolling. So they kept doing it. And for some reason, the vast majority of people like are like accept that and they're like, oh yeah, that was super sketchy. Like they actually, the pharmaceutical company actually caused the opioid epidemic. It's like, okay, so you agree with that and you see that as fact, but for some reason with vaccines, it's like, well, no, of course not. That could never be. How could you even suggest that? There's no way.
Yep.
It's very strange. It's like this very strange cognitive dissonance that
Yes.
happens there.
You hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what it is. And we're seeing it, of course, with vaccines, but with there's the food system as well, like not bridging the gap between like, could it really be all the mono and diglycerides and the seed oils and the artificial dyes
Or is
that
it
are
just
causing
because
our
we
kids?
we can diagnose ADHD more now, or like you hear that a
Right.
lot?
Oh yeah, or all these autoimmune issues or these behavioral issues are genetic, and yeah, or like you said, we're better at diagnosing. No, that's not really the case. We were actually, funny enough, so much healthier before these vaccines. And I want to mention one more thing for listeners out there who might still hold on to this belief that it's the vaccines that have been saving lives and have been making us healthier. So back in the 1800s, for the most part, this is a generalization, but the reason people were getting sick, let's say like healthy people and maybe dying at an earlier age than they should have, is there was a lack of sanitation, right? No indoor plumbing. And you literally had people who would take their, dirty sewage water and throw it out their window onto the street. We live in such a different time. Not only do we have indoor plumbing and, hand washing as a practice, which also wasn't a thing back then. We live now, the pendulum has swung so far in the other direction, and thanks to COVID too, sarcastically, thanks to COVID, we live in an over sanitized society. So you have parents who are obsessively putting actual hand sanitizer on their babies and their children's hands multiple times a day, disinfecting with Lysol and Clorox every single surface. And there's been I've witnessed just anecdotally a huge germophobia kind of renaissance in the past few years. That is making our kids sicker in a different way than when we didn't have hand washing. They're both equally bad in different ways, but the vaccines aren't helping, they are hurting. And there's fantastic books like Dr. Thomas Cowan has a great book, Vaccines and Autoimmunity, and he talks a lot about asthma, autoimmune disorders, autism, and how all of these are just common denominators in kids who have been following the schedule. Dr. Paul Thomas is a great resource just to start to plant some seeds, in case people are curious and want to just hear the other side, but also just, if you are a woman out there who likes to take other women's accounts, at firsthand, listening to the stories they have of how their children have regressed, or even, SIDS is listed as a package insert on some of these vaccines. So it's really not that mysterious. We know why SIDS happens, and it often happens as a result of getting a job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just to double down on like the toxic capitalism, I was listening to the Road to Wisdom podcast recently. Do you listen to them? It's
No.
two Australian women. They're awesome. They have like a bunch of free birth stories and just like crunchy mom things. You would love it.
Fun.
You would love it.
Okay.
And they had some fertility experts on the other day, and they brought up IVF and
Oh,
how IVF, I think, is projected to like more than double in terms of like billions of dollars of how much
Oof.
the industry is worth in the next however many years, because our
Gosh.
fertility as a whole is declining at a
Mm.
pretty scary rate. And they were talking about how like it's interesting, these fertility companies like the IVF companies, they're not trying to heal the fertility problems. They're saying,
No.
hey, come over here, come pay us
Yeah.
like $50,000, $100,000. We'll get you the hormone injections, we'll get you the drugs, we'll do the surgeries. They're not saying, hey, how's your circadian rhythm? How's your diet?
Yeah.
How's your
Right.
stress level? You know, are you
Are you
consuming
tracking?
alcohol? Yeah.
Are you even tracking your cycle? They won't
Yeah.
even bother to ask.
Yeah. What do you know about your own cervical mucus? Yeah. Like,
Yep.
you know, so it's the more we can wake up to some of that
Yeah.
stuff, the better. Cause there's this like, again, like I feel like this is kind of coming full circle. Like for me, I felt a lot of good girl pressure, a lot of
Mm.
people pleasing, that stuff. Conditioning is so hard for me to heal in myself. And I feel like that's
Yes.
kind of part of it. Like we position these doctors, like these people in IVF clinics, let's say, to be experts. So hey, if they're telling me, oh, you know, well, you're over 35, you're like probably kind of infertile or whatever it may be to some woman, we're just going to accept that because
Yep.
they're wearing a white coat. They look like the experts, especially us women have been drilled to respect
Yes.
authority, to not stir up drama, right? To listen, to be quiet, to
Yep.
be nice.
Obedient.
And so
Oh
it
yeah.
it puts us as a whole in like these really tough spots of almost then creating like guilt if I decide to take a different path. Like
Yes.
I experienced so much of that in my pregnancy and hindsight and my birth of just like how many times I did not stand up for myself and I did not
Mm.
say, hey, wait a second. And I think, you know, I went through a lot of that to propel me more on this path of like, hey, stop outsourcing your power. You know, like a
Yes.
woman's intuition is incredibly powerful. A parent's intuition is incredibly powerful. And we have to ask questions. We have to ask why. We have to ask for alternatives and not just
Yes.
like bend over to whatever the big organization with, like you said, the 3-letter organizations or whatever it may be, telling us what to do. Because in our society, we are capitalistic to our core, and there's usually a huge profit to be made.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And you mentioned the fertility industry. You're absolutely correct. Like of course, they're not interested in healing en masse everyone's fertility issues. They would all shut down and go out of business. How would they make
Mhm.
any money? And what people don't realize about IVF is right now the success rate is in the range of 25 to 33%. So you're upfront paying minimum like 10,000, sometimes more than $20,000 for these rounds, and you're not guaranteed any outcome. And then so you're out tens of thousands of dollars, and there's like a 1 in 4 or 1 or 3 chance. And then, I mean, that's a whole other rabbit hole I could go down if you want, but it reminds me too of the cancer industry. Um, I'll never forget just how commonplace it was to have these, breast cancer runs. And breast cancer, it's interesting, right? We know that actually the vast majority of cancers, I want to say it's like truly 99%. I know it sounds like I'm making that up, but 99% are turned on or off by epigenetics. So
Mhm.
through lifestyle changes. And there's really only about 1 to 3% of cancers that are truly genetic, where you can't really make an impact. This should be great news to people. Like if you live a better lifestyle, you actually have so much agency and control in whether you get cancer.
But you have to seize that. I mean, that takes
Yes.
some amount of courage to be like, uh, especially if you're, gosh, I feel like people are having kids later and later, which I'm kind of in that
Yes.
boat. You know, I'm 32 and I'm like, shit, I wish I would have, now that I know what I know now and how much I love motherhood, I wish I would have had kids earlier. But
Same.
I was so in that mindset of like, you know, you go to school, you take advantage of the fact that you're a woman and you can go to college and you can get a degree and you can get this high paying job, do all that, then think about having kids, getting married, whatever. Whereas I think that's another shift our society needs, is to think more about like, hey, women, if you want to have kids, like you really should be thinking about that in like your 20s. And hey,
Yes.
maybe when they're 10, then go get like further your education and start your career, because honestly, like biologically, that makes a lot more sense.
Oh yeah.
Like wise women in our society are like totally untapped. Like we should be thinking about those people as like having serious energy and power and being able to contribute so much. And it's it's so hard to say some of this stuff, because it's like, what are you, an anti-feminist? Like, could women should just
Kind
stay
of.
home and have kids? And I'm like, well, I mean,
Yeah.
kind of like,
Right.
because it is so biologically appropriate for us to have kids in those prime years where we feel young, we feel healthy, we have a regular cycle, we've got all this life force in us. Let's have kids then. And, but
Yes.
we're so, like you said, we are so in this boss babe mindset as a whole of like, no, I'm going to do all the things. I need to do
Yeah.
all the things as a woman. And then I can consider having kids. And then I'm still going to work 40 hours plus and raise those kids. Like it's, we kind of got it, like we are talking about the pendulum, right? Like it's almost like the
Yeah.
pendulum swung a little too far. And now what is happening to mothers, to babies, to the mother baby dyad, and to like population as a whole? I mean, we're going to see some weird things, I think, in the next like 50 years.
Oh yeah, we're already starting to see the weirdness. It's in the wild. It is sad. Sometimes it's a little freaky, but you're absolutely correct. I mean, to me, because this is like my whole world, nothing of what you said sounds outlandish or outrageous at all. It sounds just so practical and logical. And so here's how I think about like the feminist movements as we've seen them over time. So for women to be able to vote just like men do, wonderful. For women to receive fair and equal pay, great. So you can have the choice to work wherever you want, do whatever you want. Fantastic. So, but here's where it's not so good. We are not, this is not serving women, is like what you said, telling them, okay, get the job, climb the corporate career ladder, and then just hold off on having kids until you're closer to 40. This is biologically not natural. Like, yes, of course, I know. I know of women who have had wonderful natural home births, in fact, at 45. I'm
Totally.
not suggesting they shouldn't have by any means. What I'm saying is the narrative that we are shaming women into like not having kids when maybe they would have been or could have been ready in their 20s doesn't make sense. Absolutely. And I'm going to be 34 in October. And you better believe I also wish I started this earlier. And I wish I met my husband when I was younger. And yeah, you have, of course, a little bit more energy in your 20s than your 30s. Like, yes, I'm still thriving. I have all this vitality in me. But of course, I would have loved to have been a slightly younger mom. And to some like liberal feminists out there, that's like, whoa, like don't even say that. But the thing is, they don't realize they're cogs in the fertility, the industrial fertility machine, really.
Mm-hmm.
um this is feeding into that. And going back to the IVF topic, this isn't widely discussed, but it is exploitative of moms, because OHSS, or ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, is a common and very risky side effect. Also, the risk of cancer goes up. Um, and so there's a whole bunch of issues, and it's been proven that, the babies who are products of IVF, there's some health complications. They can have autoimmune issues. So you know, it's not this, I don't know, this benign kind of like perfect solution that I think we've been fed as a society to being able to do it all and have it all. I think there's a lot to be said for that balance. Like, why not just work part-time, from home, or put off your career for a little bit if you can, which this is another controversial topic, but not all, I recognize this. Some people are like juggling 3 jobs between the two of them, and they cannot work from home. But there are a lot of us out there who actually can live off of one income if we're willing to make certain sacrifices. I mentioned I used to live in New York City, right? So a lot of the friends I have who live in these big coastal cities, they choose for each person to have like, 6-figure income. And ironically, you're still feeling like you're living paycheck to paycheck because rent is outrageous. Um, Whole Foods, whole paycheck, right? Keeping up with the Joneses. So as you get promoted, you have lifestyle inflation. But if you make sacrifices and you're like, what's really important to me? Oh, yeah, family, being the best mom I can be, staying home with my babies. If you want to live in a more affordable city, maybe have a smaller home, maybe a tiny home, maybe you don't go out to eat like 3 times a week, maybe it's once a month. Like I used to be a huge foodie, go out to restaurants all the time. That
Same.
dramatically
We like
shifted.
never go out to eat now.
Same. It's also
Yeah.
not like
We
as
don't
much
drink
as,
now, so like
yeah,
that saves a lot of money. Yeah.
that saves thousands of dollars. Right.
Hmm.
Same. And so it's funny. The lifestyle, everyone's like, oh my God, kids are so expensive. I cannot tell you, my life was way more expensive when I chose to live in one of the most expensive cities in the country as a single 20-something-year-old, as opposed to being on a single income household, married with a toddler and another baby along the way. We're saving way more money than I did as a
Yeah.
single 20-something.
Hmm.
So it is mindset, and it's really, I think people don't want to take responsibility for making these choices and making these sacrifices because, oh, well, I'm not ready to give up, the big house and multiple cars. We share one car. We paid for it in cash. It is a
Mm.
used car that's a few years old. We don't care about labels. Now, there are labels I do care about, like the foods we buy. Like, so that is going to be the splurge, right? But it's
Yeah.
not going to be on the flashy lifestyle things to try to keep up with anyone. I could give
Yeah.
two craps about that. So,
Yeah. And I think just to hit on that point again of like feminism, I love that women have so much freedom these days and we can do so much, but it also shows a lot with anyone who's like, wait, did they just say like I should find a husband and have kids before I do a career for myself or create a career for myself? And it's like that just shows where we put value in our society too. So it's important to notice, like, if you have that thought of like, I even have it, like, I can feel it in my chest a little bit of like, ew.
right. I know,
Like, I
right?
can
The
feel it
program.
deep down. If like you feel that, it's important to be like, well, why am I feeling that? Oh, yeah, because I've been hammered over the head with how important and how valuable it is to have that, like, quote, successful lifestyle with the fancy job and the fancy house or whatever it may be. And how much value do we now place on having kids? It's like so much less. It's so
Yeah.
much less. And that has driven us to this place of like women having kids a lot later, because what else are we supposed to do? Like I didn't meet my husband till later either. So like
Right.
yeah. So like it shows a lot about where we are at as a society as a whole. And maybe we will start to see the pendulum come back a little bit and start to even out, is at least what I hope. Um,
Yes.
and on that note, I know we've been chatting I could chat to you all day, but I still
Same.
really want to hear about your wild pregnancy and free birth and
Yes.
like
Yes.
how, so, oh my gosh, I go like back and forth in my head all the time because we're like officially calling in baby number 2
Oh my
over
God,
here.
congrats. That is so exciting.
And I'm just like, I want a free birth. No, don't do it. I want a free birth.
Mm.
Nope, nope, like not a good idea. And this mental debate is like crushing me. And every time I meditate, the answer is very clear. But then I start thinking and I like psych myself out. And I'm like, just Caroline, stop thinking about it for a while. You're not even pregnant yet. Like, chill the F out. But I would love to hear, because you had a cesarean with your first, right?
Yes. Yep. So
Unplanned, obviously. So yeah,
yeah.
get into it.
Okay, so I was planning this home water birth, and it was the biggest 180. It resulted in a pharmaceutical induction I never wanted, asked for.
And wait, was that because of like pressure from your midwives with blood pressure? Is that right?
Yes, yep,
I
pressure
went through
because of the
that.
blood
Yeah.
pressure. Yes, yes.
Mm-mm.
So, okay, basically, in many states in the US, it is like illegal for medicalized, so like licensed midwives, to continue to see you as a client at home if your blood pressure exceeds 140 over 90. So, that's important to keep in mind. And what's interesting about that is if you ask like your average L&D nurse in the hospital system, like, what blood pressure range do you start to become a little bit concerned about? They'll tell you about 160 over 110. That's a big leap from 140 over 90. But it actually the point is, it doesn't matter like what their opinions or feelings about it are. All that matters is as soon as you're working with anyone with a license, their license will always come before your wishes and what's actually best for mom and baby. So, am I suggesting that 140/90 is a quote, like objectively good, healthy blood pressure to have? Not necessarily. At the same time, is it alarmist? Does it need to have,
Is
do
it
you
a
need to have a
reason to
mattress?
go be induced?
Of
Like,
course not.
yeah.
Definitely not. So I found myself in this weird limbo, and I had already switched providers 3 times. So I went from thinking I was going to have this, like, quote, physiologic, unmedicated hospital birth to very quickly realizing it only took 2 prenatal appointments that, like, okay, I'm in the wrong system here. So I switched to what I thought was the happy medium. And I was like, oh, I'll interview a birth center. And this is where I started to become peaked of like, ooh, this is weird. Like something's not adding up. The people I was told that were going to be like crunchier, more holistic are basically like wolves in sheep's clothing. Like it's a branch of obstetrics essentially, but they're just wearing like cutesy little outfits and have cutesy little hairdos. But this is a branch of obstetrics because I would speak to the owner on the phone of the birth center and ask some clarifying questions like, hey, what if this happens? Or like this variation of normal, right? Because all the things they deem as risky or unsafe are really 99% of the time just variations of normal. And then I got this weird, it was almost like they were like trying to hypnotize me, or it was this weird, like brainwashing one liner where they're like, well, just so you know, we have absolutely no problems at all with the local doctors or hospitals here. It was as if like they were afraid of being like caught red-handed of like having an issue with hospitals. Like that was a problem with a former client. So
Hmm.
yeah, my epiphany with the birth center before I switched to these like home birth midwives was that I went on the Fresh Test website because I was already doing all my own research. I was like, I'm not going to take the orange glucola drink. I'll get the
Mhm.
Fresh Test. And I
Mhm.
was like, I don't get it's like $30. I'll buy it myself and bring it in. Like I was like, it's a birth center. Of course they're going to let me take the Fresh Test. It's FDA approved. Like how can you
I
deny
drank
something that's FDA
OJ
approved? Yeah,
for mine.
right. Okay, so that's like, yeah, even more lax, right?
Yeah.
So the owner basically fired me later that day when I came in from my appointment. I spoke to one of the newer midwives. I was like, hey, I literally said like, hey, I have the Fresh Test and I'd really just like to use that. I didn't even ask. I did tell, I said, I'd like to do this instead of glucola. Just confirm that that's okay with me. Otherwise, that will determine whether I want to continue here because I don't want to, like spin my wheels. So the owner called me and she just I guess did me the favor by firing me and not even wasting either of our time. And she said, yeah, so I heard from, so condescending. She's like, yeah, so I heard from so and so that you said that you're going to do the Fresh Test instead of glucola. And I just want to let you know that we're not going to be making any exceptions for anyone. Like the glucola is standardized, it is the gold standard. And so, yeah,
There are
it
like a
just,
million ways to measure your blood glucose.
I
That
know.
is laziness.
And she at the birth center, and by the way, this place shut down at the end of 2022 in
Oh
the Tampa
God.
Bay area. So I mean, go figure. She already probably knew she was going to shut down. She was burnt out, right? So she doesn't want to deal with a quote difficult client like me. When I say difficult, I mean a woman who advocates for
Who uses
herself.
their mind.
Right, who uses her brain. So I'm not like monkey
Uh,
brained. It was so crazy. I just felt like so vulnerable in that moment because lots of the women who I thought, like the midwives who I thought were going to be a good fit for me, I saw on their website that they were off and not taking clients at my due date. Like I was in such a scarcity mindset instead of having this abundance mindset. And that was like my first problem. That's what led me to settle with these home birth midwives. And this is where I really betrayed my own personal values when I was on the Zoom interview with these home birth midwives and they were masked, even though they were indoors on Zoom, wearing shirts that said proudly vaccinated.
Shut up.
And they listed their pronouns in
Shut
their
up.
LinkedIn bio on their
Oh my
of
God.
their work LinkedIn bio. And
Yeah,
they
you're really
said,
in support of women if you
I
have to list your
know.
pronouns everywhere.
And
Okay.
it was she, her, and they, them. So let me tell you the cognitive dissonance I had. It wasn't even that because The dissonance would have been like, I didn't recognize there was a problem. I saw there was a problem. I was freaked out, but I was like, I wasn't ready to have a free birth at that time. And it was my first. And I literally said to my husband, I was like, well, I guess we're going to have to settle for these people, huh? Like I said, I just need someone present who's able. I think I used the terminology, like I need someone present who's like able, like who knows what to do and who can catch a baby, which is so ridiculous
Ugh.
because we know what to do.
It's what we are
We can
told to
catch our
believe,
own
though. Like,
babies.
talk about conditioning. Like,
I
Jesus.
know. I was so
Oh,
conditioned back then, and
yeah.
I wasn't real. I thought because I was so well researched and informed that was good enough. It wasn't. Jumping ahead to like now I'm 39 and a half weeks. By the way, the craziest thing was I never had a reading of 140 over 90 with them. It was high 130s over high 80s. But they said, and it was a couple times they were like, just so you know, this part is true, right? Like Dr. Stu Fishbein will even say, even a blind squirrel can find a nut from time to time. This part I'll hand to them. They were like, your blood pressure will likely increase in labor. Fact. Usually blood pressure does. They said, so here's like, there's two options for us to continue to work together. Either you can agree to have a scheduled induction at the hospital, and we can do a membrane sweep for you at your house. This way it'll be in a more controlled environment should your blood pressure spike, or we will support you. It's like not real support, but we'll support you at home if you want to continue to try to move forward with this home water birth. But just know we will continue to take your blood pressure even in labor at all times. And should it ever get to 140 over 90, you will be like medically transported. So like we're going to call EMS to transport you. So I thought to myself that the possibility of my baby crowning and having to sit in the back of an ambulance to deliver my baby at a hospital sounded more traumatic than me just like taking what little control I had back and agreeing to an induction. Okay, so baby obviously was not ready to be born. I was in labor for 72 hours. I did go the first 16 unmedicated.
Was it
Um,
Pitocin induced?
well, at first it was only misoprostol
Okay.
inserted. Yeah, so buccal, yeah. So I had 4 rounds of misoprostol. Each round, I want to say, lasts about 12 hours. I was so naive. I thought like, but also I heard like, medical kind of normie induction stories. Like, yeah, I was induced and had my baby 12 hours later. I really was naive and thought like that would be me. No, I never got past 5 centimeters. I never even wanted to be checked ever. But like what people don't understand when you're just planning for a physiologic birth is you have to. I'm not just saying this like the patriarchy, like you have to do this, but you do have to be checked if you're going to have a pharmaceutical induction at the hospital. One, they need to see like what induction method are you even eligible for? Because if you're not even at least 1 centimeter dilated, you're not even eligible for, let's say, a Foley balloon. So that's why I skipped ahead to the pharmaceutical. So yeah, 72 hours. Now my OB was quote nice, and I was shocked because usually once your water breaks, you only have 12 to 24 hours, right, to deliver your baby. But the thing is, my water was open for, I want to say 36 hours or 48 hours. And she said like she was actually using the TACO acronym, like time, amount of fluid, the color of the fluid, the odor,
Mhm.
and also monitoring me for fever, infection. So she's like, well, you don't have a fever. Like there's no odor, there's no color. So she's like, you're not on a clock, right? The problem was then after 16 hours of being under this pharmaceutical induction with no pharmaceutical pain relief, making very slow progress. And, this was the third sunset I saw, and we're not getting past 5 centimeters. I was toast. And I was still eating and drinking in labor, but then I did have Pitocin and an
Yeah.
epidural. The Pitocin contractions, it's not the same. There's no oxytocin being released. So I ended up, of all people, asking for the C-section because it was 72 hours.
Well, that's just not an environment conducive to birth.
No,
Like,
not
that's
at
what's
all.
so backwards about the hospital. It's like, what about that situation helps a woman progress their labor? Like,
Yeah,
nothing,
it's the
nothing.
opposite. It's the
Yeah.
opposite of how mammals have been giving birth in the wild and not in captivity for the last 65 million years, with the exception of the last 100 years. So, um, now I know we're sort of up, but Do you have a few minutes?
Yeah, yeah. Because
Oh,
I want to
okay,
hear,
okay.
I want to
Okay,
hear
good.
like why you're like, yes, and now free birth.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. All right, so skipping ahead, right? So basically when my son was about 17 months old, we consciously conceived the baby that I'm currently pregnant with. But
Did you say
I already,
17 months?
yes,
Yeah.
but I already knew like way before I conceived the current baby that I'm pregnant with. I knew as soon as I had that birth trauma of like really desperately wanting a home birth, like no interventions, and then having a C-section, like the complete opposite. I already knew that for the next baby, it was going to be wildly different. And the best way I could control all the uncontrollables, ironically, was by not working with anyone with a license. And that is how I saw it. So, whereas a lot of women are like, well, I need someone with a license, and I get it because I used to be that woman. Like, I need someone with a license to like to protect me, to save me, to tell me and my baby are okay. I'm like, oh no, I know exactly how this game plays out. And I know the moment there's a single variation of normal, that labor is going to stall, be disrupted. I'm going to be threatened with a transfer. So I'm going to stay out of the system. And what got me to a place of feeling like a little bit like on the fence to 200% full throttle confident in this decision was immersing myself in positive free birth and sovereign birth stories like it was my full-time job, meaning listening to a new free birth story every single day. I've gone through hundreds and hundreds of episodes. Free Birth Society podcast is a great resource. Also, being in the Lighthouse community and reading all of those stories is a great resource. But also just remembering the facts, like hospitalized birth, and I'll just say like licensed midwifery is a branch of obstetrics. These births have only been normalized and institutionalized for about 100 years or so. So if we go back, sometimes it only takes even one generation, sometimes up to 3 generations of our wise women ancestors. They were all doing the free birth thing. At birth, free birth is just birth. It's just birth. Every other kind of birth is not the normal kind of physiologic birth. But so what's interesting is in terms of this wild pregnancy and my plans to have a birth outside of the system, a lot of people, because I had a C-section, they assume that my biggest fears are things like placenta previa, placenta accreta,
Yeah.
uterine rupture. I'm not afraid of any of those things because I know just how truly rare they are. Two, I know exactly the signs. These things don't happen in a vacuum. It's not like, oops, like just had a previa. You don't need a scan to help you determine whether this will happen. And there's so many bodily signs and symptoms that will tell you like, oh, maybe I should transfer, right? And that can be your decision to make, not your expert's decision.
Mhm.
But my fears, because I had such a long labor, and this is timely because I just met with my radical birth keeper yesterday. She drove from West Palm Beach to Fort Myers to meet me, which was awesome. We spent the day together. We did a few rituals and ceremonies on the beach, and one of them
Oh,
involved me writing down my fears, saying them aloud, burning them, and then saying the reverse of that fear. And then I dumped the ashes in the ocean. But it's funny, my fears, all of them, they were all pretty similar to one another. And they're not emergencies. They're fears like, I have a fear that my labor will last days. Why do I have that fear? Duh, because my first birth, I had a 72-hour induced
yeah.
labor that was going
Yeah.
nowhere. It's
Right.
like, or like my fear is like, what if my baby, it's like a totally irrational fear, like, what if my baby just doesn't descend? Why? Because my programmed OB tried to label me with failure to descend, which is the new failure to progress. Like a failure to descend just means your baby isn't ready to be born yet. Every baby knows how to be born and they will descend. You just have to
Yeah.
give them time. Like it's ridiculous. So, um, okay, so that is how I got to where I am today. My biggest fear is not having a sovereign birth. My biggest fear is having someone with a license impose their own personal fears and
Mm.
biases onto me and their programming and try to disrupt my birth. And that's why I am not engaging with any of those people. So like in my wild pregnancy, oh yeah, so some of the normies, like on the other side of this, on like the very other side of this, when they only start to hear at a very surface level of my plans, they jump to a conclusion like, oh, so you're declining all prenatal care. That's what I gather. You're not doing anything. It's like, no, sweetie, let me clarify. having a wild pregnancy doesn't mean you are willfully ignorant to all the possibilities that can happen to you and your baby. And you're just like, I'm going to sit around and pop bonbons on the couch and I'm going to do whatever I want. It's actually, ironically, quite the opposite. Usually, the women who choose to participate in a wild pregnancy and have a sovereign birth are way healthier than the women who are having births in the system, who are like, I'm going to take folic acid and avoid beef liver and, get the Tdap jab. It's like, no, it is about fully reclaiming sovereignty and radical responsibility. And of course, you are cognizant of all the various outcomes that can happen. But women need to know that really bad things happening is actually what it does happen no matter where you give birth. I will say that home,
Mhm.
hospital, birth center, bad things are
Mhm.
destined to happen. Fine line between birth and death, but bad things happening is quite rare when you are truly giving birth in the wild, meaning unobserved, true physiologic birth. Um, and, for example, women are shocked to hear that, like, well, usually fourth degree tears are as a result of a provider medically manipulating you, guided pushing,
Yeah.
being in positions that are really unnatural. So
Yeah.
you almost never hear about hemorrhage. Like in a free birth setting, you almost never hear about a fourth or even third degree tear in a free birth setting because it's so intuitive. That's not what nature really intended. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying the odds go down.
It's actually rare. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And you will still have someone there for support, which I think is
Yes.
beautiful.
Yes. And so I just want to quickly clarify too. So sometimes the terms free birth and sovereign birth can be thrown
Mm-hmm.
around. And I did this as well. But my birth keeper corrected me and she was right. So a free birth just means you are having the birth completely outside of the presence of anyone in the birth field. A sovereign birth is what I'm planning to have, which
That's
is,
right.
yes, in the presence of a birth keeper. Now, this birth keeper, this is also by design for me. This works for me. I didn't want someone who was certified by any organization. I don't want any agency or organization oversight. I want a true, free thinking, sovereign woman. So, whereas when you're working with someone licensed, there's always an hierarchy, right? Like, even if you have the most holistic licensed midwife, like, oh, yeah, I love alternatives, blah, 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 they're always going to have authority
Yeah.
over you and they will
Yeah.
not hesitate to exercise or like, I really think we should think about a transfer if X, Y, and Z doesn't happen in the next hour.
Yeah,
Or,
that's what my midwife
right,
did. Yeah, except with
right.
stronger language, which made it me feel like I had no choices. So
Yep,
yeah,
because you were in such a vulnerable
yeah,
position, no pun intended, like probably the most vulnerable
yeah.
position. Like, what are
Like,
you to do?
mm-hmm,
And you're
mm-hmm.
scared, you're a first-time mom. Like, that's how I felt with my midwives, and I wasn't even in labor at the time. So the thing is, when you have like a radical birth keeper, someone who's it literally can just be a woman who is passionate about helping other women and loves birth. There's no hierarchy. You're all on the same plane, and it's really up to me to do whatever I want and feel comfortable with.
Mm, yeah, so beautiful. I like you will have to come back on to tell your story afterwards. I'm sure it's just going to be so wonderful.
Thank you. Yes, I would
Yeah.
love to.
Yeah, thank you for everything you shared
Yeah,
today and all of your wisdom and thoughts and free speaking. I love it.
of course.
Um, can you share where people can find you? More about the
Yes.
podcast, your Instagram? Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's Moms Off the Record, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Definitely subscribe. We release a new episode every other Friday. And then on Instagram, you can follow us at Moms Off the Record Pod, POD. Website, our website link is also on our Instagram, but I would say Instagram and the podcast are great ways to find us.
Perfect. I'll put those in the show notes. Like I said, love the podcast. If you
Thank
want more
you.
on vaccines, go listen to the episode with do you know what
Oh,
number it
Dr.
is?
Paul.
Yeah.
Oh, it's 20 something, but it's with
Okay.
you can search Dr. Paul Thomas.
And I think it's
Yes.
called Expose on Vaccines or Vaccine
And
Expose.
pediatrics.
Yeah.
Yes.
So definitely listen to that one.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for being here.
It was so
And
fun.
thanks everyone for listening. Share this with a friend, for fellow mama or fellow woman in your life. And we'll talk to you next time.
Bye.